In this lesson, what we're going to be doing is talking about the 1979 UK general election. And we're going to be providing a number of different pieces of information in terms of examining its significance and examining the decisive shift in political power that we see during this election. And this will form part of the next 5 or so videos in which we do this for every single not every single election, most of the major elections from 1979 onwards. So we'll talk about 1979. We'll talk about 1997, we'll talk about 2010, 2017, and 2019. So this lesson is going to focus firstly on the key issues and the context around the political and economic climate of the 1979 general election. We will examine the campaigning issues and the role of the media. We will then look at the results of the election, examine where the different political parties did well and did not do so well. We'll examine the factors influencing the results and then think about the assessment and the significance of this election more broadly. And sort of as a general overview, we see that the 1979 general election was a significant transformative shift, which marked the decisive change, the transformation in political power from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party. And it was essentially in response to a number of years of political and economic turmoil. So the political and economic climate of the period of 1979, of course, cannot be spoken about without thinking about the major issues associated with industrial action and the winter of discontent. The UK during the 1970s had faced a number of significant economic issues. One of these was the issue known as stagflation. This is the idea of having high inflation coupled with high unemployment, as well as frequent industrial strikes. Between 1978 and 1979, there was the, quote, winter of discontent. This is where public sector workers went out on strike to demand higher wages, which had a severe damage on the popularity of the government. And so the government at the time was, of course, the party of the Labour Party under James Callaghan, who was in power from 1976 to 1979 after the resignation of Harold Wilson. James Callaghan's government had struggled to contain the issue of inflation and the maintenance of industrial peace, but his government's failure to secure a solution to the economic crisis would lead to a decline in the public confidence of the leader of the party. And at the same time, you had the growth of the Conservative leader, Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher had been the Conservative leader since 1975 and had developed a reputation as being a quite strong-willed leader and a critic of the government's policies. She advocated for the reduction of the rate of inflation through tighter control and of the money supply, through the privatization of certain industries, and also through the limiting of the power of the trade unions. Thatcher was also a very strong supporter of reducing the state's role in the economy, which of course was in stark contrast to the interventionist approach that we see under Callaghan. So the winter of discontent, like I've already mentioned, was a widespread series of strikes involving public sector workers. This included binmen, hospital workers, and lorry drivers. They all had protested against the government's restraint policies. The strikes became a symbol of the Labour government's inability to maintain order and to manage the economy, and therefore would contribute significantly to the decline of the Labour Party's popularity. So, in terms of the main campaigning issues, the economy was the central one. The Conservatives campaigned on a platform of reducing the rate of inflation, reducing the power of the trade unions, who were obviously going out on strike, and to try and restore economic stability. The ineffective way in which the Labour government could handle the winter of discontent led to voters, particularly in working class constituencies, to look for change. The media would also play a significant role during this election, shaping the perceptions of the Labour government's handling of the economy and of the strike action. They were portrayed as particularly chaotic and particularly undermining in their ability to be able to deal with these political issues. By contrast, you have Thatcher, who was able to present herself as a decisive leader who would restore the economy and restore order in the country. And so when it actually comes to the election itself, you can see very clearly why the Conservatives do very well. They win 339 seats, and they get 43.9% of the votes. By contrast, the Labour Party wins 269 seats, and they only get 36.9% of the votes. That's a slight typo there, 36, not 26. And then the Labour Party, or the Liberal Party, should I say, only wins 11 seats, which is 19.3% of the vote. So clearly, this is a major landslide victory for Thatcher and the Conservative Party. The voter turnout was a relatively high one at this point, which was 76%. However, it was still nevertheless slightly lower than the 1974 election, which saw a turnout of 79.7%. So clearly, this is a very good result for the Conservative Party under Thatcher. And we can clearly see that the Conservative Party, securing a majority of 43 seats, gaining 70 more than the Labour Party, and winning 43.9% of the votes, clearly showed that they had translated a majority into the House of Commons. Now, in terms of analysis of this particular result, you can clearly see that one of the main reasons of this was, of course, the economic troubles, the industrial action, and the winter of discontent. The strikes in the public sector were a key reason for Labour's failure and their loss. Thatcher capitalised on Labour's failure to manage the economy and to present a strong leadership. The winter of discontent, of course, was a very big example of Labour's inability and Labour's failure to actually be able to provide any kind of strong stability on this issue. Thatcher herself was a particularly strong leader. She presented a message of economic reform to a number of voters, and it resonated with them. Her emphasis on the reduction of inflation and the curbing of trade union power struck a particular chord with the middle-class voters, who felt alienated by the so-called economic chaos under the Labour Party. You also have the influence of the media. The media were particularly strongly supportive of the Conservative Party, media organisations like The Sun, for example, and were particularly critical of Labour, especially when we think about the context of the strike actions. So, when we think about the significance of this particular election, we see that it does a number of things. Firstly, it ends what is known as a period of post-war consensus. So for those of you who are studying history and are potentially studying a history module that concerns this period of history, sort of 20th century Britain, you will know that sort of from 1945 all the way to the 1979 election is a period that is marked by post-war consensus. The election of 1979 marked a significant turning point in this British politics. It signalled the end of this post-war consensus that had largely governed the political landscape of the United Kingdom during this period. It also was the start of Thatcherism. 1979 marked the beginning of the period characterised by free market approach to the economy, privatisation of state-owned industries, deregulation, as well as a focus on individual responsibility over the welfare state. All of these are sort of associated with neoliberalism, associated with Thatcherism. In the US, associated with Reaganomics, with the election of Ronald Reagan, which would take place in 1980. There was also a shift in class voting. The election revealed a significant dynamic when it came to voting patterns. More working class voters, for example, were starting to shift towards the Conservative Party, especially when it came to areas that were suffering from relatively high unemployment and were suffering the brunt of stagflation. This shift marked the beginning of the Conservatives' appeal to a broader working class base, especially in areas such as the industrial North and the Midlands. Now, Margaret Thatcher would not do herself any favours when it came to the popularity among the industrial North, when it came to things like the closing down of the mines. But at least at the time of the 1979 election, the worst consequences of stagflation were hit by the people who are in the industrial North and in the Midlands and the sort of working class areas. This also saw a decline of the Labour Party for a significant number of years. Labour's defeat in 1979 marked an internal turmoil and reorganisation period. The party started to move left under Michael Foot in the early 1980s, but would ultimately see further electoral defeats all the way in the 1980s and even into the 1990s, and only would regain any kind of political power when we see the Labour Party shift more towards the centre under Tony Blair and New Labour with the election of 1997, which will be the topic of the next lesson. And so generally speaking, we can see that if we were to sort of do an overall examination of the 1979 general election, we see that it was a particularly divisive and decisive moment in UK political history. It resulted in the ushering in of the Thatcherite politics and Thatcherism. It ended the post-war consensus that from 1945 onwards, and it showed a broad dissatisfaction with the Labour government's handling of the economy, of industrial relations, and of public services, particularly during the winter of discontent.